Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the KDI School World Bank monthly webinar series. My name is Yandri Kim, and I'll be your host for today's session. This webinar is a joint program with the World Bank. In each session, experts from the bank share their latest findings with the KDI School community. We hope you gain invaluable insights into the cutting-edge research and also have the opportunity to reflect on how these insights can be applied in practice. Before we get started, please note that today's webinar will be recorded for knowledge sharing purposes. If you have any questions or comments, please hold them for the Q&A session or share them in the chat. Today's webinar is titled Growth and Jobs, a Framework for South Africa's Low Labor Demand. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Charl Jooste. Charl Jooste is a lead economist at the World Bank in the Fiscal Policy and Growth Global Practice. His research focuses on economic growth and structural transformation, as well as the role of fiscal and monetary policy in economic activity and macroeconomic modeling. Prior to joining the World Bank, he was senior economist and later director in the Economic Policy Unit of the National Treasury of South Africa, where he oversaw forecasting for the annual budget review. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Pretoria. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jooste.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was a very kind introduction. I'll try and keep on time, but grateful if you can also let me know if I'm a bit ahead of time. So I'll try and share my screen and let me know if you can see my presentation. Are you able to see?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, so the purpose of the presentation today is a bit broader than just the South African context. I use South Africa as an example, but one might think one can apply it to any country context. And so the idea of this presentation is very simple. What explains unemployment dynamics, and specifically moving away from this idea of hysteresis, and secondly, moving away from this idea that you can estimate employment relationships using growth regressions. And what generated or prompted this story is that I've seen too many papers, even within the World Bank, where people are making very strong, or researchers are making very strong proclamations on things like there are things like jobless growth, or that growth is not a sufficient mechanism to generate jobs. And I think that notion is false, and I think that notion can be dismissed. And so basically, the whole purpose of the presentation will try to bring back growth at the center of the job story. Without growth, there won't be any jobs. And I'll try and explain as we go along. So to contextualize, I use South Africa as a country case study. And so South Africa is a very tricky labor market case. Why? Because it has over 30 years of very important rising unemployment, and it has also high rates of discouraged work seekers. There are many hypotheses for why unemployment is high in countries and rising in some countries. Some of it's based on questionable empirics, and maybe some of it's based on political interference. Jobs is always a tricky concept, and politicians focus on jobs numbers all the time. So the proposal of this work that I'm doing is very simple. One, build a very simple stylized model to get to the heart of the issue and have a simple empirical test. And so the novelty of the approach is basically to break down any movements in the unemployment series by an intercept and explain what's describing the intercept and a slope. Okay, and so we'll get a bit behind these concepts. So typically, when we think of unemployment rates in a country, we think of it fluctuating around the fixed mean. So we think of this empirically as being stationary. So a fixed mean and constant variance. But there are some countries where there's a clear slope. So, as an example, in South Africa's case, there's a clear upward slope. So the natural rate of unemployment is sloping upwards, ever higher and higher. Obviously, there's a bound. Uh, Unemployment can only be bound between 0 and 100%. So, what explains the slope? Why is it not halting? This is a peculiar puzzle for several economists, and some of the proposals that have been made are around this idea that there's hysteresis. And the idea of hysteresis is that if demand is sufficiently low and strongly low, then it can have long lasting effects on factor and labor markets. Now, when we see things like this as an example, or charts like this, then you will be tempted to say, hey, South Africa is growing at whatever rate it's growing, maybe 1 or 2% a year. And obviously, that growth, hey, does not translate into a reduction in unemployment. Or effectively, the argument is that growth is jobless. So growth only goes into the hands of the evil capitalists, which they're not, and which I'll try to explain here. And it's not going into the benefits of workers. And the way they try to motivate this is through either one of these three types of regressions, which I call wolves in sheep's clothing. The first on the left would be the change in the employment, and small letters being logs, as functions of these beta growth rates. Or it would be the level logs, this middle equation, as functions of the level GDP. Or it would come from an input output table where M is the IO multiplier. So with this coefficients beta or M being sufficiently low, people might claim, hey, yeah, growth does not lead to jobs. The problem if you see regressions like this is you should immediately ask yourself is, well, what stops unemployment then going to below zero or even above 100%? Obviously, these are infeasible ranges. If you just extrapolate the beta times the delta growth rate, you can easily get strange outputs. Second thing is what motivates these kind of regressions? They're reduced form, they're not structural. So how do you control for things like simultaneity, where output and employment are jointly determined? And so if people or researchers use these type of regressions, then the narrative is very misleading if they say it's jobless growth, because it assumes that this relationship is fixed. So what we want to do is get around these simple regressions, move to a structural model, but still have something that's simple enough to tie down this job growth narrative. Before I get to that, I think it's maybe useful to understand a little bit the job market in pictures. Assume that there's a miner, this little guy with a hat, and assume that market's clear. This is the left chart. And if market's clear, then also assume that there are no rigidities. So what this means is the miner understands what the average miner earns. He accepts the wage during the bargaining process. There are no rigidities, so market clear, and there's no misallocation. So the miner gets allocated to the mining industry. So structural transformation, good, and the skill set of the miner is attached to the actual mine. Then we might have some issues on the right-hand side. So maybe mines run out and there are nothing to mine, or maybe a miner cannot necessarily find a job in a mine anymore because it's already at its most efficient level. But assume that the miner can reallocate to another industry because the miner's skills translate well, and assume that there are no big regulatory constraints to absorb the miner. Then what will happen is that the miner will upskill or retrain and basically move to an industry that is sufficient to the new skills. So this might be manufacturing. And this is still fine because this is in line with creative destruction. Many normally functioning economies operate under that level. Now, when things get a bit harder, is that when a miner faces problems and there are no outside options, the miner is a miner, Maybe even if the miner upskills, there are no demand for his or her services. The total economy is small and it's not growing, and there might be entry and expansion barriers for firms. Then the miner cannot allocate to any of the formal firms and might have to allocate to informal firms. In this case, there's no unemployment. The miner still has a job, but now in informality, and it might be a low paying job, but it's still not unemployed. And then we have the worst case scenario, and I'll focus on case two, which is the long run. Let an economy that is described as persistently low growth compared to its population growth, so GDP per capita is falling, that firms cannot really enter the market or expand necessarily because of regulatory constraints. And this is the important part, informality is not an option because the miner is holding out for something else or living off transfers that the government might give them, or old age pension grants if it's a young person. And in this case, there's unemployment because the miner is now not working in either the formal industries or the informal market. And just to give you a context a little bit before we get into the math and to the model, in South Africa, if we look at the unemployment rates in 2016 compared to 2024, we see that high unemployment rates typically are for people that do not have an education. So if you have a degree, basically the second from the bottom, then the unemployment rate is 6.3%. Still low, still high compared to OECD standards, but low compared to any other form of education in South Africa. Now, if we move along all the way to 2024, quarter three, then the unemployment rates across all education groups are rising. So there's this weird increase in the slope. Now, if we look at what people are studying in terms of fields, then we see that South Africa, as an example, has low STEM, math, science, engineering background compared to the OECD averages, and very high selection of business majors. So these skills matches will affect productivity A in our model. And so low STEM means lower output and low augmenting technology and basically a wider wage productivity gap. Now, there's a lot of literature about South Africa's unemployment problems. But all of this literature mainly focuses on the supply side, not so much on the demand side. So not asking, why are the firms unable to hire? Okay, so that's really at the center of the story. So we want to focus on the labor demand side, and we want to focus a little bit on our hypothesis of high reservation wages and the mechanisms through which high reservation wages affect employment decisions. Okay, so let's sketch a very, very basic model, effectively, of an economy. So assume that output Y is being produced by our normal factors of production, N for labor, K for capital. And let's say that we have labor augmenting TFP, so A augments N. And rho is measuring our standard elasticity of substitution. So how much do we substitute between labor and capital when wages versus rental wage change? So under perfect competition, so we ignore markups for a second, we know that the real wage basically should equal the marginal product of labor, or effectively output per worker accounting for the labor augmenting TFP. And we know that the real price, R, the rental rate, so the real capital price, should be basically the capital output ratio, or output per unit of capital. And we see that the sigma is a function of rho, basically higher elasticities of substitution will generate bigger shifts between labor and capital. So if the wage basically rises by a lot relative to the rental rate of capital, then it means that we'll substitute away from labor towards capital, but at this elasticity sigma. So this sigma is a very important parameter which we'll see. Now, the firm basically gets a bit more complicated. So when workers and firms bargain or negotiate prices and profits, we typically solve this problem via a Nash bargaining condition. So basically, a union would come and a union would try to maximize wages over the reservation wage. And a firm would try to bargain profits over its over its competitive profit, pi R, pi capital letter R. And then this beta would measure the union strength, or in other words, the labor markup. So WR, the reservation wage, is a very important variable in economics, and we'll see how this affects the labor demand side. Typically, we only think that the reservation wage enters labor supply, but it also enters labor demand. We'll see how. So the reservation wage is the minimum wage workers are willing to accept in the bargaining process. And this is influenced by things like non-labor incomes, so transfers, or things like minimum wages, or unemployment benefits, taxes, and preferences. And so if we solve for this problem, taking the production function into account, then the real wage that gets offered is a weighted average between the reservation wage, net of taxes, tau, and the marginal revenue of product of labor. So this becomes a key policy variable in some sense. So anything that raises the reservation wage over and above the marginal revenue product of labor affects the total wage in the economy. So social grants, minimum wages, union bargaining, public sector wage premium, it pushes this entire wage schedule above its productivity level. Now, why is this a problem for the firm? Well, the firm has to internalize this cost. So let's say you are offering your labor in the job market, and you have some level of productivity that's equal to the average economist out there. But for some reason, because of union pressure or some policy, the wage that you are only willing to accept is higher than the productivity wage. Then as a firm, for me to hire you as an economist, I need to give you that wage. Otherwise, I can't hire you. Okay, so we need to keep this into account. So when we think of the cost that the firm faces, that cost is a function of both the wage and the rental rate of capital. And using our CES form, we see it's a weighted average between W and R, and the sigma enters there. Now we can rewrite this entire wage share cost in terms of the labor share. So the labor share is just the labor share in output, which is typically wages times employment, divide by nominal GDP. Or you can rewrite it as a cost share based system. So intuitively, if the elasticity of substitution is larger than 1, and if wages increases, then it will lower the labor share in output. Basically, firms are substituting towards capital. So the labor share is not a constant concept. Very important. In pure production, Cobb-Douglas production functions, we treat this thing typically as a constant in a competitive labor market case. Now, we can augment this if we include automation like AI or task-based extension, and we can follow this Jones et al. Paper. Basically, if we know the number of tasks that are completed with labor and capital, we know the productivity, then it shifts the wages as efficiency forms. So basically, if more tasks are completed effectively from capital, then it lowers the rental rate of capital relative to the wage, and meaning that the labor share will also fall. So automation does affect the labor share, but in ways that makes the rental rate of capital cheaper relative to the wage rate. Okay. Now, we're trying to get to this notion of why the firm story is so important in the unemployment on the labor decision. So we're getting there. So when we think of the labor demand curve, we think of it as downward sloping in the wage curve. And if we take the production function and we try to minimize costs, what we typically end up with is the Hicksian labor demand curve. Basically, employment is a function of output of the firm but a negative function of wages. So we said that the labor demand curve is downward sloping. So basically, the slope of that demand curve depends on the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital. If we differentiate with regards to log wages, the cost, basically we just get back the labor share. Then the own wage elasticity of the firm, so epsilon NW just says the demand for labor given a change in wages is equal to the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital, and 1 minus Sn, which is just the labor share, which we defined above. Let's ignore the cross price elasticity for a second, but the key insight is very simple. If the labor share is small, Sn, then labor can fall a lot when wages rise, very clearly. But if Sn, the labor share, is large or gets closer to 1, there's very little capital to substitute. So meaning that if wages rise, then the firm has to internalize the cost without substituting away from labor. Now, this is why we need to move away from an Hicksian to a Marshallian type elasticity. And the Marshallian elasticity in a Slutsky decomposition type setup is the Hicksian elasticity plus the scale effects. This last part is very important. It tells me how my output of the firm, let's say I sell coffee mugs as an example, changes when wages are changing. So the scale effect of the firm is very important. So in this case, we assume that the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. And the downward sloping demand curve, the price elasticity of demand, we can specify as eta. So if we then take the derivative of output with respect to wages, then what we get is the downward sloping demand elasticity, price elasticity of demand, multiplied by the labor share. So our Marshallian elasticity now becomes a function of two things, the Hicksian elasticity and now the scale effect. So now we have two effects in place. We have a substitution effect, so how quickly firms replace labor for capital when wages rise, and how quickly firms scale away in terms of the labor share when they face a downward sloping demand curve. Two quick notions, and then we'll get into the empirics. So let's quickly define two things. Let's define the wage productivity gap omega as the real wage per efficiency measure, where A is TFP, W is the wage, and P is the price. And let's define labor productivity typically as output per worker, so GDP per worker. Obviously, we have to have labor augmenting TFP. We can rewrite our labor share then, labor share as wages, real wage divided by output per worker, as these two margins. And since this Sn, the labor share, already features in the Marshallian elasticity, we can directly replace Sn with our two margins. So here we have a very nice and the key equation that we can estimate and try to model, and it's fully micro-founded, is that the Marshallian labor demand elasticity is a function of the labor elasticity of the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital times 1 minus this omega, which is the efficiency wage, divided by output per worker. So what's the mechanism here? A higher reservation wage will lead to a higher omega. So this omega is scaling up. So the gap between wages and productivity widens. Typically, we want to think of wages should grow in line with productivity, but now we can see that we have policies that can widen the gap between wages and productivity. But it also increases the weight on the scale effect. And remember, as firms, you're very sensitive to this. So once this ratio of the efficiency wage to the labor productivity gap becomes very large, then labor demand completely collapses. Basically, firms will not hire workers. So we see that policies that are well intended, let's say for equity or for poverty reduction, can actually lead to way worse outcomes, at least theoretically, in the sense that it can lead to no workers being hired. and effectively higher unemployment. So let's try and understand the magnitude of this labor elasticity through a two-dimensional chart where the colors represent the labor demand elasticity. The colors are basically on this gradient there. So on the x-axis, we have this omega divided by phi, so effectively the efficient wage divided by labor productivity. And on the y-axis, we have the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital. So with whatever estimates we have for the labor elasticity of substitution between labor and capital, and the gap between reservation wages and productivity, for South Africa, we see we fall on this green line, the labor demand elasticity is equal to roughly 1.2. What does this mean? It means the following. For a 1% increase in wages, labor demand, holding all else fixed, will fall by between 1 and 1.2%, meaning firms in this economy is super sensitive to wage changes. Now, if your economy falls in either of these blue ranges, then it means your economy is less sensitive, or firms are less sensitive to wage changes. Now we can get to the unemployment equation effectively. So when we think of unemployment being constant, and we think of this equation 16, meaning the growth rate of labor, GN, minus the growth rate of the labor force, LF, needs to be zero, this left-hand side, for unemployment to be constant. If we plug in our labor demand elasticity, then we get this very interesting condition of what's needed. What's needed is that the reservation wage growth needs to equal TFP growth, accounting for this employment elasticity. Now, in the Cobb-Douglas case, sigma just goes to 1, and the labor share becomes constant, so Sn goes to alpha, and the scale effect, eta, disappears. Then the labor demand elasticity is just 1 minus alpha from the Cobb-Douglas production function case. Then plugging this into our employment dynamics equation, so the growth rate in employment minus the growth rate in the labor force must equal then the growth rate in TFP minus the growth rate of reservation wages, WR, accounting for the slope of the demand curve. So for stability, reservation wages, and this is real reservation wages, cannot exceed TFP growth. Anything that pushes reservation wages above TFP growth will lead to unemployment. Go back to one thing to make this case. So our wage, remember, is a weighted average between the reservation wages, which we want to grow in line with TFP, plus the marginal revenue of product, which should also grow in line with TFP so that the weighted average is equal to productivity. So any policy that pushes this thing up, the reservation wage up, will ultimately lead to unemployment. Now, so far I've only spoken of the labor demand side, but we can think of the labor force participation rate as some function of the wage that the worker can earn relative to the reservation wage. So basically, if the wage that a worker can earn is higher than the reservation wage, also we have an increase in labor force participation, where phi tilde is just effectively the elasticity of labor supply. So then we now have a full model of our growth rate of unemployment, which depends on the labor force growth. Assume that this thing is just growing at the working age population GPOP, and then minus this employment growth trap. So now we have an intercept slope decomposition for unemployment. So it's very sensitive to the gap between wages and productivity. So an increase in the reservation wages, holding productivity growth constant, will decrease equilibrium employment and increase the unemployment rate. So the jobless growth narrative completely collapses on itself, because it's not that there's not that growth cannot generate jobs. It's that we do not have enough growth relative to the reservation wage. So we need more growth relative to the reservation wage to have sufficient jobs. Or we need to reduce the things that increase the reservation wage so that whatever productivity growth we have, that jobs can get created. Now, there's a developmental context here that we see in the data. So we now shift to the empirical side, and I'm being mindful of that time. So I still have about 10, 15 minutes, I guess. So we think of a country's development breaking down into low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries, Hicks. And let's say we plot the reservation wage growth to TFP growth gap minus the working age population growth. And GU is the slope of the unemployment rate. What we find, and we'll show this in the data now, is that low-income countries have very high population growth. But for some reason, many of low-income countries have very low unemployment rates. Why is that the case? They have low unemployment rates because they have not a lot of options in the outside markets. Basically, we see that there's high informality that absorbs the excess labor supply. These guys don't work in the formal job market, but they do not have the, in quotation marks here, the luxury to be unemployed because they have to survive. So they have to go into an informal market. For middle income countries, we see that this slope of the unemployment rate, the GU, is increasing. This typically happens because middle income countries now have slower labor force growth, but they have more outside options relative to productivity growth. And so what we see is that there's higher changes, delta in unemployment. Now, very interesting fact is what's happening to high income countries. High income countries have very generous benefits, high transfers to households, income benefits. Yet, according to the theory, you should expect then that unemployment rate should also increase in those countries, and it doesn't. And the only reason it doesn't is because in high income countries, the labor force is shrinking. So take note this last expression on the y axis, which is GW pop. GW pop is negative, so it offsets the gap between reservation wages and TFP growth, and hence the slope becomes more constant. Now we want to empirically test this, and what challenge we have is that most countries do not have some data series or time series data on reservation wages. You can maybe get it for some labor force surveys where they would ask it, but most countries do not have it. But we still have an empirical test, and a very simple one, strangely enough, and luckily enough. So the insight is the following. If the change in the unemployment rate is positive, it must mean that the change in labor force growth rate relative to employment growth rate must be positive. For this to hold, it must mean that the slope of the demand curve multiplied by the reservation wage growth gap to TFP growth must be positive. You can run a very simple reduced form regression of country I, of the growth rate of employment, on country I, on the growth rate of the labor force, and estimate kappa. And epsilon is just, or var epsilon is just a reduced form error. So theory would predict that if kappa is lower than 1, then reservation wages must grow at the rate faster than productivity, which means we can extract the implicit reservation wage growth. So we've done this for 98 countries, and we see something interesting. So if we plot the growth rate in employment on the y-axis, the growth rate in the labor force in the x-axis, and we look at countries where unemployment rates are low, we see that these countries almost fit perfectly on the 45-degree line. Basically, unemployment is constant. Kappa will equal 1. When we move to countries where unemployment rates become large, let's say between 5 and 11%, then we see that these dots are starting to deviate from the y-axis. They become more scattered just along, deviate from the 45-degree line and become more scattered along the y-axis only. So effectively just an intercept. And then for very large unemployment cases, the dots completely deviate from the 45-degree line, and they effectively just an intercept on the x-axis. Okay. If we try to estimate kappa on both the working age population and the participation rate growth, we see the same pattern emerge. We want these dotted lines to be equal to 1, meaning kappa is equal to 1. And in most cases, for high-income countries, low-income countries, they are. But here's the funny part. For upper middle-income countries, the bottom right chart, we see that the mass of the distribution of elasticities are lower than 1, exactly what our theory was predicting before. Okay, so why don't wages just adjust? We think of demand and supply intersecting, and if demand and supply curves intersect, then wages is the equilibrium outcome. But we see this is not necessarily happening. So obviously, if wages are super flexible, then the real wage would undo any part of this wage productivity gap, and unemployment would become a constant variable. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for some reasons. There might be collective bargaining, minimum wages, insider power, where nephews and nieces and cousins hire each other. In South Africa, there are compliance costs on equity. This BBBEE is broad-based Black economic empowerment. Or there might be some skills mismatches. People are studying for things for which firms do not demand. So if there's excess, maybe economists out there, but there are not enough jobs in economics, and the wages of jobs for economists do not fall, then we might have unemployed economists. So if firms cannot adjust their wages, other margins must change. What are these margins? Either employment needs to go down, or firms must scale down because they have to internalize the cost, or workers need to go into informality, or worse, workers and firms need to exit. And basically, you can do this for your own country, proxy reservation wages and productivity. So the proxy for reservation wages that I'm using would include things like remittances, government transfers to households, minimum wages, as an example. And you can see for South Africa, this dotted line, we have these big spurts of reservation wage growth in real per capita terms. And it typically outsizes labor productivity and TFP growth, the orange and black lines. Or if you were to plot the change in the unemployment rate on the y-axis and plot the difference between reservation wage growth, our proxy, and TFP growth, you'll have some positive slope, exactly what we predicted earlier. You can also plot the Marshallian elasticity. So for low Marshallian, for high Marshallian elasticities, the change in the unemployment rate typically becomes lower. So key takeaways, and then I'll end, and then we can go through some questions. So if you have low economic growth, it will shed labor for sure. And this is scale effects. This is not a jobless growth narrative. Okay, so this jobless growth narrative is false. Okay. Second thing, if labor productivity growth is higher than TFP growth, then this omega phi thing shifts, and you will have more firms hiring workers. It makes sense. If I can hire workers that are doing the job at a much higher productivity growth and total factor productivity growth, I'm going to hire more workers. So basically, it's not just low TFP, but also low labor productivity that drives down the demand for workers. Key takeaway number 3. If reservation wages grow in excess of productivity growth, then we will have an increase in unemployment rates. For middle-income countries, these reservation wage growth needs to consider transportation costs, transfers, unions, remittances, and even queuing for government jobs. In the Cobb-Douglas case, for unemployment to be stable will require that reservation wage growth cannot exceed TFP growth.